Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I hope your quizzes went well. I'll be looking forward to reading those this week. This week, we are continuing on with the Renaissance in Italy during the 15th century, known as the Quattrocento. The Italians named their Renaissance period after the century. Quattrocento just means 1400s. And so, on with the show. If we return back for a minute to the work of Giotto and the early Renaissance in Italy, remember some of the key features of that period that you were asked to talk about in your quiz to some degree were the rise of a middle class, the breakdown of the feudal system, and the rise of the middle class, where merchants, and eventually they will become bankers as well, have worked very hard for what they've achieved. They embrace a humanistic philosophy, drawing from precedents of earlier golden ages of Greece and of Rome. They look back to those periods in the early Renaissance mainly to kind of gain insight on not so much the stylistics of art, but the philosophy of art. And so we talked about the period style of the early Renaissance in Italy being one in which you see a greater degree of naturalism. That corresponds with the humanistic interest in this world being very important, not just a kind of trial to get into heaven, but a stage of life, a stage of being in which we try to perfect ourselves and we try to perfect our society and those around us. We also said a component of that early Renaissance style was an interest in didactic forms of art that is to teach, again, corresponding with the idea of elevating our society and those around us. We also said there was an interest in human emotion in order to make the works relatable. That is something that is going to disappear in the 14th century 15th century, all the way through the Italian Renaissance to be replaced by rationalism, a control of the emotions and a privileging of the rational intellectual mind over the emotions. We also said during this time period of the early Renaissance that you'll get a lot of works of art that well, I guess it corresponds with the idea of teaching, in which you have a number of elements in the work of art that are understandable for many people. Now, all of that remains the same, and in the 1300s, 14th century, of course, Italy is beset by a horrible plague that destroys at least 2/3 of the population. So you don't see a lot of art really being produced, we could, if it were a longer class, we could look at some of the art forms that were being produced during that time period. But it tends not to be very conducive to art making, and so we pick this story up in the 1400s again with the rise of really Renaissance ideas proper. And one of the big changes that occurs in the 1400s, and this really gets going by mid-century, as you'll see, is remember the story in which Rome now, over here, if we look at this map, Rome and the Vatican is its own kind of territory within Italy, or what we call Italy today. It wasn't Italy then. It's its own territory. It's very stable, and a lot of people are emigrating from the area over here in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, back to Italy, and they're bringing with them all of these classical ideas. Well, by the middle of the 1400s, 1453 to be exact, Constantinople is finally sacked by the Ottoman Empire, which we see over here. And the Ottoman Empire, by the way, is Muslim. That leads a lot of the Christians back to Rome again, and they bring with them more of these classical, philosophical, and scientific texts, as well as a great degree of classical examples of, in particular, sculpture. And so this is the time period in which, in addition to classical philosophies and forms of learning, classical texts, we get more and more examples of classical arts starting to influence the period style of the Quattrocento or 1400s in Italy. And that's really the main story of today, along with a very, very complex stitching together of classical philosophy, primarily from people like Plato and Aristotle, with Christian theology. And that is what we call the aesthetic philosophy of Neoplatonism, which is a very important component of the art of the Quattrocento and all the way into what's known as the Cinquecento or 1500s, or what we'll call the High Renaissance period in Italy. So on with our story then. Before we get to that aesthetic philosophy, just look at these two examples on the screen in front of you. On the left, something familiar to you. It is the tympanum of San Lazzaro Tun. And as we said when we were looking at this the first time through, these artists weren't interested really in representing something that bore a likeness to our everyday world. They were more interested in the ideas of spirituality and setting before us stylized images, very flat, very planar, very much about communicating the spiritual ideals rather than something that was in any way correspondent with things in our natural world. It wasn't their a goal to represent something more naturalistically. On the right-hand side, something that will be unearthed in Rome during the time of Michelangelo, so a little bit after this period, you see an example of a Greek art, or at least we think it's Greek art. It could be an early Roman copy of Greek art, a little bit later than the classical period, but partaking of all the qualities of classical Greek art. It's called the Laocoon group. And while it is a gorgeous sculpture, and I'd love to go into great detail about it with you, this class is really about a particular time period. So let me just say that what we're seeing over there on the right is something that looks very naturalistic at first glance. But here's the big idea for today. It's not naturalistic. It's idealistic, meaning it looks like something natural, but that naturalism has been submitted to an idea of perfection. We're trying to make the human form perfect rather than something that is natural or looks like everyday people. And we'll talk quite a bit today about what the aesthetic philosophy behind that is. So another example of this would be to look at a close-up on the left of San Lazzaro Tun. Very elongated figures, stylized figures, flat figures, versus this, what's known as a metope. It's an area of sculpture on the Parthenon in Athens from classical Greece, in which we see a human figure battling with a centaur on this great temple to Athena. That looks, again, our first thought would be it looks naturalistic. Those look like real human bodies. Centaurs we don't see every day, of course, but that looks like a horse's behind, body and so forth. But they're very idealized and made to look even more perfect in their symmetry and in their proportionality and so forth. And the Renaissance artists of the 1400s are certainly very interested in the idea of idealism. And at first thought, you can just say, this also partakes of the humanistic spirit of perfecting ourselves and perfecting our art so as to represent not the everyday mundane world, but a more perfect order of human existence. Other examples, just to make clear, on the left, a work that will come back later today called the Aphrodite of Cnidus, the female perfect form, and on the right, a famous Roman copy of a Greek sculpture of Hermes toying with the god Dionysus here. He would have been holding in his broken off right hand a bunch of grapes that the young god of wine is hoping to get from him, and Hermes is just playing with him. But the big point is, if you're looking at these bodies, these are representations of the perfect ideal based upon what's known as a canon of proportions, perfect proportionality throughout the body to indicate a kind of idea of the divine existing in this world all around us. Our first work for today by an early classical Renaissance sculptor by the name of Nanni di Banco. This is a work called The Four Crowned Martyrs. They are life-size, all carved out of marble. They're set within a little niche. A niche is just a kind of shallow space in a wall. And this one's a framed niche known as an edicula, which is a term that's on your handout for today. It's actually under Masaccio where the term comes back again. And let's just start with, why was this created in the first place? At the time in Italy, all artistry was basically controlled by what were known as guilds. The guilds, for lack of a better way of putting it, are kind of like the Renaissance form of a contemporary, a contemporary kind of labor union. They controlled whether you got patronage. They usually set up young artists with master artists so as to teach them. They are kind of the education and business mechanism for the various forms of art. And there were guilds to painting, guilds to marble carving and wood carving, guilds to goldsmiths, and on and on and on. The reason I bring this up is not just to tell you how artists were educated and how the business kind of unfolded. You would go to a guild to get a commission more often than not. You could ask, of course, for a very specific artist and set it up that way, but the guilds were kind of the middleman. But also because this sculpture is something that was produced for the exterior of a building in Florence, which is still there today. It's called Orson Michel, a building that had been around for a while, but had been repurposed to house numerous guilds during this time period. And each guild, after they were given a space in this gigantic building, it's like a block-long building, were offered space on the exterior to basically advertise what they were up to, what their artistry was all about, and to create an exemplary work to showcase this. And this is the sculpture that was meant to basically advertise for the stone carving and woodworking guild, and they commissioned Nanni di Banco to do that. Now into the subject matter here. The subject matter is actually drawn from the classical period of Rome. However, it is referencing a group of 4 Christian sculptors who were asked by probably a Roman, although it's not specified, someone who was pagan, meaning not Christian, to carve sculptures of pagan gods. And they refused. This is back in the 4th century CE, so over 1,000 years before this work is created. They supposedly refused on the grounds that in the Bible, they are forbidden to represent any other gods than the Christian God. And they refused all the way up to being threatened to be killed for it, which eventually they are executed for it. And thus they become martyrs for Christianity. That's what a martyr means, someone who dies for their beliefs and usually is sainted or is at least held in very high esteem by subsequent cultures. So it's a perfect subject for a Christian carver who wants to emphasize, on the one hand, a connection to classical sculpture, meaning these were classical sculptors, but they refused to, and this is what makes it Christian, to carve a god that was not their own. So a perfect way to kind of encapsulate the idea that the contemporary stone and wood carving guild of Florence here is very Christian, but also very interested in classical ideas. On the top are the 4 Christian martyrs here. They are what are known as sculpture in the round, meaning that you can go all the way around them. Whereas down below, you see what's known as a relief sculpture. And we've talked about this before. Relief sculpture is sculpture that's carved, but still is attached to its background. You can't walk around it. And we call things that are very deeply carved, meaning they stand out from their background, high relief, and things that are very shallowly carved as low relief. Down below, what you're seeing is them at work in their studio, and up above, you see them kind of glorified, just standing around, hanging out. pull these figures out of their niche so that you can see them more. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because we're going to pick up the ideas and make them more complex as we go along. But one of the things that you probably notice right off is that they're roughly the same size. The reason they're the same size and have roughly the same proportions is that they are based upon a canon of perfect proportions. Canons of proportions are basically module systems to set out the relationship of all proportionality within the body. And by this time, during the Renaissance, artists are looking back to classical sculptures and determining the system of ratios or canons of proportions in those earlier sculptures and creating their own sculptures based upon this. Now, what I mean by a canon of proportions is, for instance, these bodies are approximately 7 heads tall. So if you took 7 heads and lined them all up, that body, including the head, would be almost precisely 7 heads. Proportionality also is things like, and this goes way back to the Greeks as well, the distance between one digit, so this knuckle to the end of the finger, and that ratio to the entire finger, which is about 3 of those digits to one finger, will be a ratio that's used to derive the proportionality of all fingers. It's also a ratio that's used to derive the distance between the end of a finger and the palm. This is 1 unit of measurement, and there are 3 of those units of measurement in the entire arm of a figure. The same thing goes with the feet and the thickness of the body and so forth. This is a mathematical system, basically, based upon things like the golden mean. Sometimes it will be a ratio of 3.1 something, in order to come up with a perfect ideal body. Let me go back there for a minute, too. The other thing that I can point out about this being classical is they're all in that standard contrapposto pose that we've talked about, that kind of characteristic weight shift, where the body leans back onto one leg while the other leg is freeform. And if this is still confusing to you, remember some of these terms are best explained if you just go look them up in the glossary of the text, or when you come across them in your reading. You spend a little bit more time on them. But you can see how this knee, for instance, over here is bent. The other leg is holding the weight of the body. Same thing over here, a bent leg and the weight of the body on this. That was something that the Greeks figured out early on as a way to animate the body and make it look more naturalistic, that is now being adopted and becomes a standard pose during the Renaissance period in Italy. So you see these sculptors hard at work, marble sculptures for various things. In this case, it's probably not a historical reference. It's meant to say, hey, these are all the things we can do. We can carve a large-scale human body. We can carve small-scale bodies. We can carve things that will go on architecture. We can even, forge some things over here. And that's all a relief sculpture. One of the highlights of the Quattrocento is the artist Lorenzo Ghiberti, who was not a carver. He didn't work in what's known as subtractive sculpture, where you take things away, like marble carving, in order to create the form. He was a bronze caster, working in the cire perdu, or lost wax process, which we've talked about before. Lorenzo Ghiberti, early in his career, I have up here in front of you a work from the Florence Baptistry, which is the building that was the place that important people went to get baptized in Florence, that is directly across from the Florence Cathedral, which is the main kind of cathedral in Florence. And early in his career, what you're seeing here is an example of the north gates. These are just little plaques that were on the doors that he decorated with these bronze insets. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is St. Jerome in his study. I just wanted to show you this to show early in his career, he's still kind of halfway in between late Gothic, early Renaissance arts and later Renaissance arts. And what I mean by that is, just like we saw in the Scrovegni Chapel, you've got a quatrefoil form here, a kind of decorative framing for the scene. And that scene doesn't have any background. It just shows you a fairly naturalistic representation of St. Jerome translating the Bible from its original Hebrew into the Latin. This is known as the Vulgate version of the Bible. And he's important for doing this very important work. The body here is idealized. It does show a real body underneath the drapery and so forth, but you'll see as we go forward to his next commission, after he became famous, he was given a commission to create the east gates of the Florence baptistry, and he has really developed his style quite a bit. So let's spend some time with that. What are known as gates, right? They're just doors. They're all cast bronze, little insets here. Each one of these is cast bronze. All these areas over here, cast bronze, that have then been gilded, meaning layered with a thin layer of gold leaf to make them even more precious and beautiful. They were titled The Gates of Paradise by Michelangelo, who, when he saw these, was blown away and just thought, this is the greatest work of the preceding century. They're all scenes from the Old Testament, and I'm not going to go into all of these, and frankly, I'm not going to go into the major subject of the first one that I'm showing you so much, primarily because this isn't a subject that comes back a lot. So we're going to look at this scene right here. This is the scene of Jacob and Esau up close. And you can see the difference in the style over these periods. The big one is that what Ghiberti has done here is he's adopted a number of techniques that were figured out by Renaissance theoreticians and painters in particular to create an illusionistic depiction of space in this relief sculpture. So let's get on here even closer. The story of Jacob and Esau, in short, is one in which Abraham gives birth through Rebecca. It's a very long story, by the way. This is the wife, Rebecca, and Rebecca over here. I should say this in its start. This is what's known as a simultaneous narrative. Remember, we talked about this before, in which multiple different moments of a story are contained within the same frame. So we have, for instance, Abraham here, Abraham over here, the wife Rebecca, and the wife Rebecca, the wife Rebecca. It's different moments in time, all contained within the same scene. In any case, the subject matter or the story is that Abraham gives birth through his wife Rebecca to two children, Jacob and Esau. They're twins, and Esau comes out first, and by rights he should be the inheritor of Abraham's wealth and title and such. But he's not as good a candidate as Jacob. Jacob, by the way that Christians interpret this Old Testament story, is much more in line with kind of Abraham's values. He's much the better figure. And so with the help of God, and you see this up here in the top right-hand corner, Rebecca is asking for God to tell her what to do, knowing that one child is better than the other, but he was born second, is given directions on how to fool Abraham into bestowing his blessing on Jacob rather than Esau. And then the whole story unfolds where they trick Abraham into doing this, and here he is giving his blessing. I'm not going to spend any more time on that story. It's not important for the remainder of the class. So let me focus on the things that are very important. I didn't bring an example of this because we're going to see it so many times in painting that I figure you can just come back to this and figure it out. But the entire spatial system of this temple that's in the background is figured out by what is known as linear one-point perspective. What linear one-point perspective does is it allows an artist to generate an illusion of three dimensions on a two-dimensional surface, or in this case, on a very shallow three-dimensional surface, by making all lines, and I'll show you a diagram of this coming up, all lines that would be receding away from us, but that are perpendicular to our picture plane, meaning, for instance, these lines up here that are the top of the temple, make all these lines recede to one central vanishing point, which is right about here. And all of the areas, including these areas down here of the tile, which you can see these converging lines, all recede back to that one central vanishing point. Now, as I'll bring up later on, this is not really the way that our eye sees space. Our eye distorts it a little bit, and frankly, this isn't even the way that a camera or anything else sees space. This is an ideal space. This is a perfect rendering of space, and it partakes of the idea that, and I'll bring this up and flesh this out coming up, that because God made this world and he is the divine craftsman for Christians, there must be something of his perfection in this world, and it becomes the artist's duty to show not the way that things really look to our eye, not the appearance of things, but the underlying order that exists in the world because God, being perfect, placed it there. The other way that the artist generates the illusion of three-dimensional space is pretty brilliant. As things appear further away, they keep getting lower and lower relief. So as things are closer to us, they get higher and higher relief. And this is kind of like a sculptural version of what's known as atmospheric perspective, which I'll give you a few examples of as we get to painting. But we've brought this up briefly before. You may have noticed when you're looking at things that are further away from you that they lose their detail and they lose some of their color, and that's because there's more atmosphere between you and things that are further away. And painters have known this for a long time and made things that are further away decrease in their detail and decrease in their color. This is just a sculpture adopting that technique and making things that are further away very, very low relief. This is just kind of incised in the surface of the relief sculpture. If it gets a little bit closer, it's a little bit higher relief, a little bit higher relief here, and you can see these figures in the foreground are almost carved completely in the round to make them appear closer to us. The artist also uses another technique to show three dimensions. We know that things that are further away from us also decrease in size to our eye, even though we know they're the same size. And this is called size diminution. These, by the way, are all terms that are included on your first handout, the introduction to art history into the course. I don't put them on every lecture guide because I don't want to confuse all of you, but if you're kind of thinking, oh, this is coming too fast, I don't know how to spell that term, just return to that original lecture guide and have that out in front of you as you go through the lecture so that you can get the spelling of these terms and make sure that you know them in detail. Right, so size diminution, the idea that things that are further away appear to our eye to be smaller, and that sculptors will use this to create the illusion of three-dimensionality. The final big thing to point out is that when you're dealing with painting, this is going to be hard for me to do on a lecture with a video, but when you're dealing with painting or two-dimensional arts, when something like an arm is sticking out towards you like this, it's very hard to draw that. You have to do what's called foreshortening, making it look shorter because it is poking out into your space rather than something that's off to the side where you can get the full length of the arm. And the artist has even tried to do that down here with the leg of Jacob, which is in roughly 3 dimensions, but has also been foreshortened from the knee down here so as to increase the illusion of three-dimensionality. Now again, every figure in this sculpture is created according to a canon of proportions, a perfect module system to generate the perfect proportionalities. Once again, based upon the principle that God made us all, he made us in his image. Therefore, there must be something perfect in the human body. Maybe we don't see it. Maybe some of us aren't exactly the ideal, but the artist is attempting to show you that perfect ideal through those canons of proportions. I'll show you a couple of close-ups of this. You can see all the carving. This is a scene of Abraham and Jacob over here, and you can see the use of size diminution of the figures in the background. You can see from the side a little bit more of the three-dimensionality of these figures. They've basically been welded to the surface of this bronze casting and then gilded, getting his blessing. Then just one more scene here so that you can see this. You know, these are glorious relief sculptures, all cast in bronze and then gold-plated. This is just one of the marriage scenes called the Marriage at Cana. Once again, using linear one-point perspective, you can see these lines down here receding to one central vanishing point. right? And all the lines recede to that point, every single one of them that is would be a converging line recedes to that point. Everything is perfectly balanced. Everything is meant to be ideal. So it's to give us a picture of God's kind of divine order in the universe around us. Back so you can see, I'm sorry, from the front, but from the side, so you can see a little bit more of how high in relief this is. What it looks like from the back, various components actually are welded onto the surface so as to be more three-dimensional. Whatever reason, my favorite sculptor of the early Quattrocento is Donatello. Donatello impresses me because his style, his own personal style, is so varied. He does so many different things here. I will go on the subject of this a little bit more. It doesn't turn up again so much in art class, but if you were to take the next class, Art 128, you would see the story of Salome turning up quite a bit. And Salome figures very prevalently in this story, which is this title of this work is called The Feast of Herod. But the story is really, how did John the Baptist get martyred? How was he killed? And so before talking about the image here, let me just give you that story. And for me, it's kind of funny. John the Baptist, of course, is usually by Christians understood to be somehow related to Jesus as a cousin. Historically, he probably wasn't. He was probably a preceding kind of prophet who was working out, baptizing people in the Jordan River. But that's not particularly important to this story. In any case, what happens, remember Herod. Herod was in Giotto's work. He was the person who was basically administering to Jerusalem for the Romans. And he's a bad guy. He was the one who, of course, killed all the young children, infants in Jerusalem because he didn't know who Jesus was in that famous scene of the massacre of the innocents. He goes on to be a pretty sinister figure in the Bible, including this scene. The story goes this way. Herod was unmarried. I forget if his wife has died earlier on. And his brother dies, leaving his brother's wife a widow. Now, for many cultures, the job of a brother, if your brother dies, is to marry the widow if you're unmarried, and that's what Herod does. He marries the wife of his brother, whose name is Herodias, and she comes along with already having a child by the name of Salome. Now, in the Bible and in the Apocrypha, all these stories that kind of swell out of the biblical stories that are not straightforward dogma, Salome is represented as a gorgeous young woman, just totally gorgeous. Usually they sex her up quite a bit, and Herod can't keep his eyes off her. He's kind of the creepy old dude in this story. And Herodias uses Salome throughout these stories to basically manipulate Herod. She gets her daughter to do various things. Herod then bestows gifts on the daughter or gives Herodias his wife whatever she wants. And in this story, what occurs is that John the Baptist has been taken prisoner by Herod. He's been locked in a dungeon. Herod doesn't know quite what to do with him. He's afraid of killing him because he's, in the biblical stories, afraid of, what will come of this, whether the Christian God will be angry with him or others will be angry with him, the followers of John the Baptist, for instance. And so he just leaves him there. And John the Baptist, of course, isn't cowed by being held prisoner. He continues to kind of preach his Christian philosophy, including telling the new wife of Herod, Herodias, that she's basically an adulterer because she should have never remarried after her husband died. She should remain faithful to him even in his death. And he just keeps kind of going on. You're an adulterer. You're an adulterer. You're a horrible, sinful person. And Herodias, of course, is pretty pissed off about this and goes to Herod a number of times and says, kill that guy. I'm tired of listening to him call me an adulterer. And Herod won't do it. So eventually Herodias goes to her beautiful young daughter and says, hey, go dance for Herod and we'll get him to do what I want him to do. And Salome dances this famous dance of the seven veils, which never is fully in the earlier text described, but one can imagine this is a dance that's a bit of a striptease where a veil comes off and another veil comes off and another veil comes off. And while Herod is watching this, he just keeps getting more and more turned on, right? He's just this kind of slobbering, old creepy dude who wants his stepdaughter. And when she gets done, Herod says, "I will give you anything you want. What do you want?" And Herodias, the wife, leans into her daughter and whispers in her ear, "Ask for the head of John the Baptist." So Herod, having made this announcement that he'll give her anything she wants, and she asks for the head of John the Baptist, decides he'll give her the head of John the Baptist. And that's what you see occurring here. It's been a big feast. In the background of the scene, if you look at it, there are people who are cooking in the far background. In this middle zone here, you see musicians playing music, and in the foreground, you see the giant feast in which Herod has just been presented with the head of John the Baptist. Now, of course, everything in this work is about the revulsion that occurs when people actually see this act. So look at these figures around them. Even Herod can't believe, what he's done here. And this work has a moral message. It's about lust, right? That lust leads Herod to do an unspeakable act and kill this emissary of God. And even he and his court recognize that. That's what's being represented here. Once again, in this scene, you have Donatello using the same techniques that Ghiberti was using. It's all rendered in one-point perspective. You can see this in the floor tiles, everything receding back to one vanishing point in space. All of these lines up here receding to one vanishing point. He also uses different levels of relief sculpture. In the background, very low relief, and as it gets closer to us, higher and higher relief to create an illusion of 3 dimensions, right? He uses size diminution. He uses things that refer to atmospheric perspective. And there you see the revolted face of Herod as he sees the consequences of his lust. There's also a bronze cast that has been gilded. You see how low the relief is back here. It's just like scratches in the surface, very, very low relief forms. They get a little bit higher relief and then very high relief in the foreground. Donatello is also credited with creating the first freestanding bronze sculpture since antiquity, in this work called David, although there is some question about whether this is David or someone else. We're going to stick with the more kind of tried and true interpretation that this is David. Now, we've talked about David before. David, in those stained glass windows, is an early Jewish king, King David, one of the most prominent. Before he becomes king, however, and remember, the lineage of Mary is passed down or considered to go back through the line of King David. Before he becomes king, however, he has this incredible heroic act. And that act is that as a young boy, when the Israelites are faced in this battle with this overwhelming force, and I think these at this point are Philistines, he steps up to the plate and he says, "I will take on this powerful warrior of the Philistines whose name is Goliath." And Goliath he's old, he's past his prime, but he's a huge, powerful, seasoned warrior, and there's no way in hell, that David should be able to win this battle, and yet he does. The way he does it is that he uses a sling. It's not a slingshot. It's one of those slings where you put a stone in this thing that you kind of spin around your head, throws that stone, it hits Goliath in the head, knocks him out, and then he runs up and cuts his head off, thus leading to the victory of the Jews. So it's about the moral story of David is really about the triumph of right over might, meaning the triumph of someone who is a Christian for Christians, although, again, these are the way that the Christians have interpreted the Old Testament. David is an Old Testament figure. The triumph of someone who's a Christian or has Christian values over even more powerful forces. Now, unlike other sculptures that you'll see of David, including Michelangelo's famous David, this one's a little bit weird, frankly. And I don't mean weird in a bad way. I mean weird in the sense that it doesn't seem to be all that heroic. First of all, David looks incredibly sensual. He's got a kind of exaggerated S curve to his body. The bronze casting has been very, very highly polished and patinaed so that the light dances off it. And he's got this kind of jaunty hat on his head and this kind of hand on his hip. It looks a little bit effeminate. And so you got to wonder, okay, what is he trying to say about this? And this is where it gets strange. The sculpture has some components to it that have led people to believe either it's not David at all, or it's David, but as a metaphor for sensuality. And what I mean by that is, again, look at the curve to his body. It doesn't look heroic. It's not like he's triumphantly stomping on his head, which we'll see in a moment. It's where, I mean, it gets very sexualized. The helm of Goliath has these giant kind of feathered wings on it. One of those wings kind of slides up the interior thigh of David and disappears somewhere, in his crotch. So what's that all about? And then if you go around to the front, so there's a close-up of that. Around to the front, what you see is that foot, David, rather than like stomping on the head of Goliath or saying, I've vanquished you or whatever, is really just kind of resting on his cheek, and it looks almost like his toe is playing with the mustache of Goliath here. And on the helm of Goliath's, helmet here, you actually see what look like prisoners, little young men being taken as prisoner in battle by some kind of ancient chariot. So what does this mean? Well, one of the interpretations is that what you're seeing is a kind of metaphor meant to be homoerotic, meant to be for someone who commissioned this work who was a man who liked men, and there were many during the Renaissance, by the way, including some of the major artists of the period, which we'll get to in a moment. Even though it's against the edicts of the church, homosexuality has been around forever. There were tons of Greeks who were, of course, homosexual. Matter of fact, they didn't really think of homosexuality as its own thing. I mean, men were with men and women were with women and men were with women, and it wasn't that big of a deal. So again, back to the story, one of the interpretations is that what we see is a David as a youth, a beautiful youth, who is basically slaying the values of, slaying the kind of the power of an older, more stronger man. And if the interpretation is correct, what it's trying to say is that we're all kind of subject to our passions and our senses and our desires, and this is playing upon that notion in one way or another. But we don't know. What we can say is that there appears to be very clearly a homoerotic element to this work. It's not meant to appeal to women, it's meant to appeal to other men. And this just is a way for me to let us all know that, of course, homosexuality has been around forever, even within the most kind of hard and fast Christian cultures, because sexuality is a complex thing and can't be reduced to a number of moral edicts. You wouldn't think it. If I showed you these all separate, this is another sculpture by Donatello of Mary Magdalene. In this case, it's a wood-carved sculpture that's been polychromed. That just means painted and layered with varnish. But we've seen Mary Magdalene before, and most of the time, Mary Magdalene is this beautiful young woman who is a follower of Christ. However, no one has, to this stage in our story, represented Mary Magdalene after the Noli Me Tangere scene, the scene in which Christ says, no, you can't touch me, after he has been resurrected. And according to the stories, Mary Magdalene becomes, the emblem of repentance after Christ's death. She's already been this, right? She was the woman who came to Christ as a fallen woman. She's a composite, of course, of historical characters in the Bible, but just thinking of that composite, she is a woman who initially comes to Christ as a prostitute, is usually the way she's interpreted, and falls at his feet and cries at his feet and wipes his feet off with her hair, thus leading to all this iconography of her hair. Remember, her hair is a symbol, as it will be over and over again in art of the West, of women's passion or their sexuality. But here it becomes something other. If you're wondering what she's wearing, this cloak seems to be her hair. Her hair is grown out, and no longer is it a symbol of her passion, it's a symbol of her religious fervor. After Christ dies, what occurs is that Mary Magdalene becomes an ascetic. Remember, asceticism, asceticism, means someone who divorces themselves from worldly pleasures and just simply leads a religious life. She goes off into the desert and just contemplates Christ in many of the stories, and all of her youthful beauty goes away because she doesn't care about those material pursuits anymore. Her hair, instead of being a symbol of her sexual desirability, now becomes something that just clothes her nude body. You know, it becomes the opposite in a way. And let's just get up here. The goal of the sculpture would have been, people would have thought of Mary Magdalene as this beautiful, frankly, kind of sexed up figure who now is, you know, she's an ascetic. She's old and withered and sunburnt and pays no attention to her appearance. Everything is about her religiosity. That would have been the thing that makes this so appealing to people. Just in brief, I'm going to talk about this work. I wanted to tell you that side by side with the paintings that you'll be seeing that we spend a lot of time with are a lot of works of art like this one by Gentile da Fabriano. This one's called The Adoration of the Magi. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a nativity scene, but it is of the style that you probably can recognize this, right? If you look at this up close, and I think I have some other close-ups of this. What does that look like to you? What does that remind you of? What it should remind you of is the Book of Hours, the Treurischer by the Limbourg brothers. It is a holdover from the early Gothic style that continues to be a component of painting throughout this entire Renaissance period, primarily, although not exclusively by any means, patronized by the aristocratic class. And so you see, again, these very decorative bodies, all the kind of luxurious clothing that they're wearing, stylized figures rather than naturalized or idealized figures. The first major painter that we're covering from the 1400s is Masaccio. Masaccio is just an excellent example of the period style of the Quattrocento and these period style attributes will be the same all the way through the High Renaissance, meaning next lecture as well. They just keep getting further developed. So what you're looking at here is a fresco, so painting on wet plaster, of the Trinity. And the Trinity, for those of you who are still murky on this, you'll need to go look it up because it is a confusing idea, is that God exists basically in three forms that are all the same. He is God the Father, He is the Holy Spirit, which you see here in this work, this little white band, and He is the Son. In other words, God made into a human as Christ. So a central kind of premise of Christianity. Now, if you look at this, did I bring in a close-up? In situ, as they call it, as it exists, you'll notice that this is in a church in front of the altar place. So this would have been kind of like an altar piece where you look at this as the priest was doing his stuff on the altar. And it's all painted in trompe l'oeil, meaning hyper-illusionistic, fool the eye type of painting. The subject matter, as I said, the Trinity here, it's painted as if it exists in an edicula, again, a framed niche. On the interior of this are two other characters that you'll become ever more familiar with. That's the Virgin Mary in blue over here and John the Evangelist over here. And then just like we saw in the Scroveni Chapel, of course, the people who commission this want this to be an expiatory offering for the public to recognize that they have made this, commissioned this work of art, and for God to see, bear witness to the fact that they are doing good deeds. And these two people are the patrons. Notice how the patrons are outside of the frame and that they're kneeling to make them less important than the figures that are in the frame. And then down below this, painted in grisaille again, gray tones, is what appears to be a relief sculpture, but it's painted of a skeleton sitting on a plank. And above that it says, "That which I am, you will also be." This is what's known as a memento mori, a term that's on your handout, which means a reminder of death. And what a memento mori is meant to do is to remind you, even in this humanistic world, that we will all eventually die, and that everything that we do in this life should be with that in mind. We should keep our eyes on the spiritual goal of our salvation. That's what a memento mori means. And it can be a skeleton, it can be a skull, it can be anything that reminds you of death. And sometimes that has verbiage with it, and other times it's just a symbol. Getting close on the crucifixion scene. Show you a diagram of this in a minute, but you should be able to tell already just by looking at this, if you just were to stick a ruler up or stick your thumb up, all of these lines are going to recede to the same place. That means this is all done in central point perspective, linear 1-point perspective, and all these lines will recede to that one place. So that is an idealized space. Other components of this work are that within every classical work of art, and remember, the Italian Renaissance is a classical style. Classical style is a style that just means a trans-historical style. It keeps coming back. It was, a part of the style, of the period style of the early Greeks. It's a part of the period style of the Romans, and it's a part of this period style, the Quattrocento. All classical styles seek to create a hierarchy of subject matter, meaning look here first, and this is most important, and then look there, that's secondary important, and then look there, that's tertiary importance. The first place that you look, and again, these terms are all on your first handout, is the focal point, F-O-C-A-L, meaning the focus of your attention. And you just follow your eye here. If you keep looking at Christ as the focal point, that's because he is the lightest figure, he's right in the center, and he's uninterrupted, right? There's nothing in front of him. He also faces off to the picture plane, that invisible barrier between us and the scene, not the surface of the work of art, but as if, well, the picture plane is as if we are looking into another world. Like this is a window that separates us from this other world. The picture plane is that window pane that separates us. And this torso faces that picture plane. It's frontal to the picture plane. So we look at Christ first. You can't help but follow the white above him to the Holy Spirit and God hovering up above him. These are all important. But then look how Christ's head tips to one side and his eyes, which are closed, but they still point this way, create an implied line that make us look down here at Mary. She's the second in importance to this group of the Trinity. And then notice how Mary's hand points this way, and we move over to John, and John looks back at Christ, right? So that's how our eyes moved around. Now we might also then move beyond these to the patrons, right, in order to achieve this tertiary area of importance. We'll pick up the stylistics of this, and I'll give you an entire list, but I'm going to give you a primer of this as well, right? Renaissance style, first and foremost, is about idealism, creating the perfect ideal, and everything in a work of art then is meant to achieve this ideal. In this case, so far, that ideal is perfect space, created using linear 1-point perspective. Second ideal, perfect proportionality. All the body parts add up to this whole. Each are proportionate to the overall body. Another ideal is perfect organization of space, where you look at a focal point and a secondary point of interest and so forth. Another component of Renaissance idealism is an emphasis on the rational, things that appeal to the mind rather than the emotions. And in this case, it's a crucifixion scene, but no one seems all that sorrowful, right? They're not crying. They're not lamenting this. They are, stoic in a way. They are keeping their emotions at bay. Another component of Renaissance period stylistics are that everything is balanced and oftentimes symmetrical. So if you split this down the middle, notice how there's equal weight on both sides. If you've got a figure here, you've got a figure there. You've got a figure here, you've got a figure there. This is balance and symmetry, and that balance extends even to the use of colors. Look at how God has red on one side and blue on the other. And down here, Mary has blue, and John the Evangelist has red, and then we balance it out by having a red over here and a blue over here, and so on and so forth. This is the system of perspective used to generate this. This is what's known as two-point perspective. We'll pick this up later on to show you how this works, whereas the one-point perspective of these other parts all recedes to this one vanishing point down below. Moving on to another work by Masaccio, a subject that is an important subject in the Bible because it emphasizes Christ's disinterest in money. Like, money doesn't matter. You shouldn't get caught up in material wealth because it will lead you towards sin. Is this giant fresco by Masaccio known as the tribute money. And the tribute money is a story from the Bible in which a Jewish tax collector, who you see here, and this is a simultaneous narrative again, so you see one moment in time here. The Jewish tax collector comes to Jesus and he says, hey, you've got to pay your taxes. And Peter, who is right here, who's always the grumpy one, is like, how dare you tell Jesus to do anything? We're not paying. And Jesus says, wait a minute, Peter, don't even worry about it. Money doesn't matter. Let's get this guy off our back. Peter, go over there to the water, because they're all fishermen at this point, and pull a fish out and all will be solved. So here's the second point of the narrative in this simultaneous narrative. Peter going off to the water and he pulls out a fish, and in the fish's mouth are enough coins to pay the Jewish tax collector double the amount that he's owed, meant to emphasize the idea that Jesus doesn't care about money. And then over here, you see that the Jewish tax collector is being given his money by Peter. Right? So simultaneous narrative, that's the subject matter. But the most important thing, again, are the ideals. So what are the ideals? Right off the bat, you should recognize all these figures are represented as the same size with the same proportionality. So they are using a canon of proportions to create ideal bodies. Number two, space is being used and generated using linear one-point perspective, and I'll show you a diagram here. But that linear one-point perspective is deriving all these lines that you see in this work, and there are actually 2 points of reference here. In any case, that's an ideal space. The artist has also used, and this isn't an ideal, it's just a way to create an illusion of three-dimensionality, atmospheric perspective. Look at how, as we get into the distance, the mountains lose their detail and get less and less colorful and more detail in the foreground. Another ideal of this is the organization of the way we look at this, right? What's called the hierarchy of the subject. Jesus is our focal point. Why? Well, this is where it exists, by the way. It's in relation to a whole bunch of other paintings. Did I bring another one? This is the focal point. One of the reasons for this is he is right in the center. No one overlaps him. He's got the most contrasting colors. Remember, contrasting colors are colors almost opposite each other on the color wheel, and here red and blue next to each other make each other more intense. No one overlaps him except for, of course, the Jewish tax collector, who is shown wearing different clothing, and he overlaps him so as to emphasize the idea that he's intruding upon Jesus. He reaches into his spatial bubble, so to speak. He is also, so we look at him first, and then Jesus, of course, because all these figures are around him, we're going to look at them and wonder what the story is about, but then he points us. It's an implied line, right? And Peter points again to point us over here, and then if you remember the scene, we come back into the scene, and the Jewish tax collector points over here to show the scene of Peter paying off the money. He's also the focal point because he is the vanishing point for the one-point perspective of these rooftops that are pointing towards him as well, right? The Jewish tax collector, by the way, made to look different than everyone else. Not wearing any pants here. The pants emphasize his legs. On the one hand, this is a way for Masaccio to just show that he knows how to render a human body. But it fits in with the story. That's a sign of vanity. Believe it or not, back in the day, it was men showing off their legs rather than women. And this is a sign of his vanity, and that goes along with his material aspirations for money. So the final part to the story I want to emphasize is all Renaissance works of art are very rational, and that extends right to the way that they are lit. So instead of just kind of making up where the light source is that would illuminate this scene, the way that Masaccio did this, and you can see if you look at these figures, right? The light hits on this side. There's the highlight. And the other side of the face is dark. And that is rational all the way through. It works the same way on all these figures. The way that he determined the light source is actually by using a real light source in the space in which this fresco is. Right here at the top or right edge is a window. That's a real window. And that real window is used as if that were the light source to illuminate this scene. Now, of course, it isn't, because these are all painted to look like that as the light source. But that's how rational Renaissance artists get. Moving on to another artist here, and I'm going to take a brief break here, but this is Fra Angelico's work. Give me a moment. I'll be right back. You'll notice very little. Okay, so actually what I've decided to do is backtrack a little bit. I usually when I'm giving these lectures in front of people, it's easier to kind of explain linear one-point perspective and how it's showing up in works of art and why this is important. So before going on with Fra Angelico's work, I'm going to go back to the tribute money and try to explain this in a little bit more detail. Linear one-point perspective is just a kind of rationalization of the idea of converging lines, which, you know, we all know from when we were a little kid and you're trying to draw something like train tracks, that lines that are perpendicular to the picture plane, lines that in real life would be parallel, as they go away from us, appear to converge. And in linear one-point perspective, all we've done is made that a rigorous kind of system in which, in linear one-point perspective, there's a horizon line that you see here. And on that horizon line is what's called a vanishing point, to which all lines recede. This isn't the way that your eye actually sees things, but it's a really good way to create the illusion of three dimensions. But even more important for our story here, it's a perfect order to the universe. It's a perfect, ideal spatial system. And in the tribute money, for instance, and I could have shown you this in all of the works of art, linear one-point perspective is being used, as you see in these red lines, to generate all of the lines within this picture that would be running perpendicular to the picture plane, and in this case, to emphasize the idea of Christ as the center point for the picture and the most important thing to be looking at here. I also want to talk, before we go any further, about something that's complex, and take good notes on this. And BAS students, you will be asked to be doing some work on this and sharing that with the rest of the class, which is to explain why ideals mattered so much to Renaissance artists and to show how they came from classical aesthetics and classical philosophy. And so on the screen in front of you, and so what we're talking about is the aesthetic philosophy of Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism just means new Platonism. And you can think of this as a kind of mingling together of ideas from classical philosophers, including Plato and Aristotle, with Christian ideas about God as the divine craftsman. Some of you will be slightly familiar with this for some of you, this will be completely new. And so just kind of think your way through it. What I've got up on the screen in front of you right now is a diagram of Plato's view of the universe, of how things exist in our world. And if you've ever read Plato's allegory of the cave, you've got a kind of head start on other people. But if you haven't, let me try to explain this to you in the best ways that I know how. So for most classical philosophers, what they're trying to do is to make assertions based upon universal, timeless concepts, to be able to say why something should be true for all people of all times and all places, what you oftentimes hear referred to as objective truth, versus the alternative, which is that everything is subjective, everything is a matter of interpretation. And maybe one of the easiest examples to start with is to say, you know, for a classical philosopher, the idea of beauty, which is really what these artists are after, trying to create ideal beauty. You may have heard the phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? Everyone has a different view of what beauty is. There's no way to prove some kind of universal beauty that it is the same for all people of all times, of all places. Now, classical philosophers would say that's just being lazy. There is such a thing as universal timeless beauty, but how do I prove that that's true? And the way that Plato tried to prove his assertions was to say that our world, which you see in this diagram referred to as the phenomenal realm, the realm of phenomena, the realm in which we exist, is really just an imperfect reflection of a more perfect realm, which Plato calls, or rather we call, us interpreting Plato, the realm of forms, or the realm of the eidos. This is very complicated in a way. I'm going to try to make it less complicated when we get to Neoplatonism, but think of it this way. If you're sitting in a room that has chairs in it, you can look around your room and probably see or think that there are many, many different kinds of chairs in the world. And yet we all recognize them as chair. Now, what Plato would say is that the reason we're able to recognize them as chair is that everything that is in this world, everything that we see around us, is an imperfect reflection of a realm of forms or concepts that are universal and timeless and transcendent, that never change. And what we're seeing in the chair that we see in front of us is an imperfect reflection of the perfect concept chair. Now, Plato's not really interested in chairs. He's interested in ideas like beauty and truth and the morally good and so forth. But if you start with that premise, just think abstractly. What he's saying is that the world in which we live isn't really conducive to objective truth. It's all ruled by our senses, and that if we wanted to understand things in themselves, in their kind of universal timelessness, we would have to access this more perfect realm of universal timeless truths. Our world is an imperfect reflection of that. Now, according to Plato, and of course this extends to Renaissance artists, if then you were to represent a chair in your world as perfectly as you could, make it look exactly like the chair in front of you, this would be worthless for both Plato and Renaissance artists, because then what you would be representing, and this is referenced by the bottom tier of this diagram, you would be referencing something that is an imperfect reflection of an imperfect reflection. You're making a copy, or what Plato called mimetic form, a mimetic art. You would be making a copy of a chair in our world, which is already an imperfect reflection. And so for the Greeks, as for the Italian Renaissance artists, the idea is to represent perfection rather than something that looks like something in our real world. Aristotle came along and had some arguments with Plato, and I would love to go into all the details about this. But basically what Aristotle said was, Plato, you've got it all wrong. By the way, they didn't live at the same time, but Aristotle came after and was kind of arguing with this major philosopher, saying, Plato, you got it all wrong. The order that exists in the universe is here. in our phenomenal realm, it's just underneath the appearance of things. We can't see it right off, but it's there governing all things. And I usually think of Aristotle, who was an empiricist, meaning interested in observing phenomena to come up with rules and this system of order. I usually like to use the example of physics. If you've ever taken an introductory physics class, you know that while it might appear that the world and things that happen in the world is really kind of chaotic, completely random, there are physical laws that govern, for instance, gravity and how fast things fall, and so forth. Or if you're into popular culture and you remember the movie The Matrix, in The Matrix, the basic premise of this, Keanu Reeves trilogy is that the world in which Keanu is living, or which he thinks he is living, is really just a virtual reality. And beneath that virtual reality is a whole host of computer code that actually is generating that virtual reality. So for Aristotle, as for Plato, the thing that would really matter in this analogy is the computer code, the order that exists beneath the appearance, which is a falsity of our nature. Now, the place that this usually starts to make sense to students, and I want you to be able to explain this to each other, is that if you bring into this equation Christian theology, the beliefs of Christians, and you mix it together with Plato and Aristotle, you get what is known as Neoplatonism or Neoplatonic truth. And in this system, think of the realm of Plato, that realm of universal timeless truths, as being synonymous with what Christians believe is God and heaven. I mean, for Christians, God is perfect. He's all-knowing. He's all-powerful. And one would believe that heaven is perfect. And because, of course, God made this world and made us in his image, Christians would believe that there's something of God's order or perfection in this world around us. Thus, the schematic that I have up here for you to look at, where because God is the divine craftsman, he made this world and he made us in his image, there must be something of God's truth or order beneath the appearance of things in this world around us. So you get kind of Plato in there, Plato's idea of the realm of forms, being like God in heaven, universal, timeless, transcendent, the generator of all things in this world. But you also get a little bit of Aristotle, because Christians believe that God made this world and he's perfect, so there must be something of his perfection in this world. And you get something of Christian theology, right? God is the divine craftsman. There must be something perfect in this world. Now, in the past, traditionally, the mediators or revealers of God's order in the world were the clergy, right? Popes and bishops and priests and so forth. But during the Renaissance period, artists start to think of themselves as mediators, and other people start to believe of artists as mediators, as if they are divinely inspired to see God's perfection and to create God's ideal perfection in their own paintings and sculptures. See, they're not interested in representing the world as it looks, because that would be an imperfect reflection of what is already an imperfect reflection, a painting of something that exists in this world that is just a reflection of the divine. So what they're interested in doing is creating the ideal so that we come in contact with God's perfection in the world. And that's the aesthetic philosophy of classicism in general, but here with the Christian element to it, Renaissance aesthetic philosophy as well. So the short recap is just this simple, but I want you to explain how Plato and Aristotle get mixed up with Christianity, which is to say, if you believe that God is perfect, and if you believe that God made this world and made us in his image, it stands to reason that there's something perfect within us and something perfect within this world that is underneath the apparent chaos of the world. And chaos is a kind of relative world. It just means randomness. that the artist can see that we can't. And the artist is basically picturing that perfection so that we come in contact with God's perfection as well. Simpler kind of summary of this is Plato's idea of what he called the Platonic triangle. That Platonic triangle, which you see here on the screen, it basically means this, that if something is beautiful, if you represent something as beautiful, and by beauty I mean beauty with a capital B, an ideal beauty that is not just about, I think this is beautiful, but it's beautiful for all people in all times and all places. If you represent something that's beautiful, it must also necessarily be truthful and morally good, right? So beauty has a symbolic value to it. It's also seen as being truthful and morally good. And the reason that Christians believe this is, of course, the Platonic triangle looks suspiciously like they're symbols of the Trinity. And they also believe that God is beautiful, good, and true all at once. And so that if you represent something that is meant to be good, you must make it beautiful. If you represent something that is meant to be truthful, it must be represented beautifully. This is called the Platonic triangle. Now, before we go any further, and you can this moving back as well through Masaccio's work, here is again, an enumeration of all of the stylistics that we associate with the period style of the Italian Renaissance that get perfected in the next lecture, the High Renaissance. So as I said before, number one, the interest is in ideals, and now we've learned why ideals matter, because they represent God's perfection in the world. Number two, unity. Unity is a tricky term, but what it means is that everything in a Renaissance or classical picture or sculpture needs to be connected, usually to an overall theme, right? So the theme of the subject matter or the theme of the moral message. But also unity means that all of the parts of a painting should be there in order to further the overall message of the work, such that nothing could be added or subtracted, or it would break the whole. Now, if you've taken a writing course, a good analogy for this would be when someone is telling you that if you're writing an essay, you have to have a thesis, right? You have to have this central concept of your paper. Everything in the paper should support the thesis, right? In writing, that's the idea. In a painting, the same thing. Everything should be supporting the overall message, and that's what the unity of the work is. How do you create the ideal? Well, here are some watchwords. Rationality, clarity, and order. They all are kind of similar, and they all mean that the work of art should appeal to the mind, not the emotions, because this mimics God's order, which is very rational. How do you get the rational? How do you get perfection? Well, number one, perspectival systems like linear one-point perspective or linear two-point perspective. Number two, and we'll see this more and more as we go forward, a clear organization of space, not only using a focal point, but differentiating the foreground from the middle ground from the background. You don't see Renaissance pictures have this kind of fluid shift between foreground, middle ground, and background. They tend to say, here's the foreground, here's the middle ground, here's the background. So clear organizations. In the Renaissance, line, what the Italians called disegno, was understood to appeal to the mind. So you'll see a hard emphasis on contour lines rather than exuberant colors. Colors were thought to appeal to the emotions. And then number four, and you'll see this over and over and over again, and you've already seen this so far, stability in the composition. More often than not, Renaissance composition, which means the organization of figures within the space or organization of parts within the space, use the pyramidal form, a three-dimensional triangle, or use lots of horizontals and verticals, but not a lot of diagonals. Horizontals and verticals and pyramid forms are really stable. They don't look like they move much at all. They feel like they are, set and not going to tip over, and they are understood to appeal to the mind. In addition to that, you will see an emphasis on balance and symmetry, as well as what are known as analogous colors, colors that are close to each other on a color wheel and thus harmonize with one another. And those are the key stylistics of the Renaissance period, from the 1400s through the 1500s. That being said, unfortunately, maybe for my lecture, the artist that I wanted to just show you one work of is someone who's a little bit of an anomaly. He doesn't follow these rules that I just gave you. This is Fra Angelico's work called The Annunciation. I love it, so I can't leave it out. Fra Angelico was a monk who was also a painter, and his main job was to create murals and frescoes for monasteries in order to decorate them and also give the monks these images to contemplate their faith. We've seen an Annunciation scene many times before. In this case, you're seeing on the left the angel Gabriel visiting Mary again, who is in some kind of weird kind of Gothic interior-exterior structure that is meant to look like a church for reasons that we've already covered in this class. But what's different about this work than what you've seen before is that Mary looks a lot more humble. She looks like a regular person. She's really relatable, much more like the Northern Renaissance style than the Italian Renaissance. She's not made of an ideal canon of proportions. Her proportionality is a little bit odd. And so you can tell that this artist isn't really following the rules of the Italian Renaissance per se. The thing that I wanted to talk about, though, here is if you get up close on some of this, look at the angel Gabriel. Why is he not as commanding as the Virgin Mary? Why is he not the focal point? Well, one of the big reasons is he's been turned in profile. And so instead of facing us and commanding our attention, he's turned in profile. And he doesn't show as much, he doesn't kind of command as much of our attention. If you look at the Virgin Mary, it's slightly tipped her form towards the picture plane so that she's more open to us. She's a little bit bigger than him as well, which makes her more of the focal point of this picture. The other component of this picture that's so interesting is the symbolism that is included in here. And I'm going to go back to this overall scene again. Symbolism is, number one, right down the middle of this, you see a column. This is really standard in representations of the Annunciation. It's an axis that separates the spiritual realm of Gabriel and the mundane or everyday realm of Mary. Why do we do that? Because remember, this is God coming from the spiritual realm and entering the material realm or mundane realm through Mary. And so you want to show some kind of symbol of that transition. Another symbol is the window behind Mary that's inside of a door. Remember, Christ comes so as to open a door for us all to go to heaven. The window, as we've seen before, is a symbol of her purity or her virginity. Light passes through the window without breaking it, just as God enters the Virgin Mary without disrupting her virginity. The panes of the window are 12. This is for the standard symbolism of 12. There are 12 gates of heaven for Christians. And then we see over on the left-hand side something that should be fairly familiar to you by now, which is a hortus conclusus, an enclosed garden. There's a big fence around an area that has tons and tons of flowers and foliage. That's a symbol of the Virgin Mary's virginity here. Now on to maybe one of the most iconic artists of the Quattrocento in the Italian Renaissance. This is a work by Botticelli. Sandro Botticelli was a painter who painted the vast majority of his works for the powerful Medici family in Florence. The Medici family, and if you want to see a funny, dramatic form of the Medici family, there's a new series on Netflix that goes into their Lorenzo's kind of great exploits. You can find it there. The Medici family is the powerful family of Florence that is one of these newly emerged middle-class families who basically funds huge components of the Renaissance. They're the ones buying a lot of these works of art. They're also a family that really admires the classical philosophers, and so they collect a lot of their texts. They collect a lot of the classical sculptures that still existed, and they teach about Neoplatonism through a man by the name of Marsilio Ficino, who was a philosopher himself. And so they are dispersing these ideas that we've been talking about in this lecture. Sandro Botticelli is famous because he brings into the Italian Renaissance Greek mythology, Greek and Roman mythology. Of course, the Greeks come up with the mythological stories, and then the Romans rename all of their gods and continue to believe in those stories. And what you're looking at here on the screen is one of his most famous paintings. This is Botticelli's Primavera, or Allegory of Springtime, as it's sometimes called. What you have here is the first major representation in our class of the goddess Venus, who, that's the Roman name for the Greek goddess Aphrodite. Now, in Greek times, and we'll talk about this more and more, Aphrodite was the goddess of love, of sexuality, like blatant outward sexuality. She was the god of fertility for many of the Greeks as well. And she's the god of beauty. Now, the reason she's the god of beauty has to do with this great story that the Greeks tell, in which, to give you the short version, there is a big feast on Mount Olympus, which is where the Greek gods live. And everyone's invited to this feast, but for whatever reason, and it's funny, ironic, the goddess of strife is not invited. And because she's the goddess of strife, she decides she's going to create a furor over the fact that she hasn't been invited. And what she does is she takes a golden apple and she inscribes on the exterior of this, "To the most beautiful," or "To the fairest." And yes, if you're wondering, we have stolen all of our fairy tales, or many of them, from Greek myths. It sounds a little bit like the story of Snow White or something, right? And she takes this golden apple, the goddess of strife does, and she rolls it in on the banquet table, and it says, "To the most beautiful," and immediately all the women goddesses in the Greek pantheon say it must be for me. But very quickly, the numbers dwindle until only the three most important goddesses are left arguing about who is the most beautiful. And these goddesses are, and I'm going to use the Greek terms and give you the Roman terms as well, Aphrodite, or Venus, Hera, or as she's known by the Romans, Juno, or Athena, or as she's known by the Romans, Minerva. And they all say, "Hey, I'm the most beautiful." And they go to the father god Zeus, and they say, "Zeus, you need to decide which one of us is the most beautiful." And Zeus, frankly, for all of his failings, he's always on the lookout for hot young ladies, is smart enough to realize that this is a no-win situation. First of all, he's married to Hera. And second of all, he realizes, if I choose one of them, the other two are going to hate me. So what he decides to do is pass this job on to the young prince of Troy, Paris. He doesn't really like Paris at this stage, by the way. And so the god Mercury, or Hermes, who you see over here on the left-hand side, who is the messenger god, goes down to the young Trojan prince and says, "Hey, I've got a job for you. How would you like to determine who the most beautiful Greek goddess is?" And Paris, he's a mortal man, wakes up and says, "Whoa, I'd love to." And these three Greek goddesses show up and they take off all their clothes, and just imagine being, this is a total male fantasy thing, by the way, heterosexual male fantasy, waking up and seeing these three gorgeous goddesses, flawless, and you have to judge who is the most beautiful. And he can't decide. They're all equally physically gorgeous. But then they start bribing him. And Hera says, "Hey, if you choose me, you'll be the greatest leader of all time." And Athena says to him, "Hey, if you choose me, you'll be the greatest warrior of all time." She is the goddess of strategy and wisdom, in warfare in particular. But Aphrodite has kind of the trump card here. She says, "Hey, if you choose me, I will make any woman you want fall madly in love with you." And she conjures up an image of Helen of Troy, who is a demigod and the most beautiful woman who's ever existed. And Paris falls deeply in love and awards the apple to Aphrodite. And therefore she becomes from that point forward the goddess of beauty. Now, when we get to the Renaissance times, all of the messy sexual innuendo of the goddess Aphrodite and Venus goes away. Christians are pretty allergic to sexuality, particularly within women. And so, for instance, in Greek times, the goddess Aphrodite, if she wants to get anything done, she just seduces people and they can't resist her. But in the Renaissance, you can't have that type of god. And so the god Aphrodite becomes known as Venus, and she becomes just a kind of personification of timeless, universal beauty. Plato's idea of beauty, universal, timeless beauty, a representation of, frankly, God's beauty in the world around us. So that's a long version of that story. And really what this is about is, frankly, fertility, although kind of cleaned up. She's not doing anything too provocative. The goddess Venus is in the center here. To her right are her attendants, known as the three graces. They have no symbolic import. This is frankly just an excuse used by artists to show three beautiful women from different perspectives. So for instance, you get a side view and a butt view and another side view over here. To their right is the god Mercury, or Hermes as he's known by the Greeks. You can always tell Hermes, he's usually wearing winged sandals or sandals, and he holds in his hand an Adusis, which is our symbol of the Surgeon General, a staff with snakes intertwining at the top. Up above them all is Cupid, who by the Renaissance time is being represented as a fat little cherub guy with a blindfold on, indiscriminately shooting people with his arrows that inflame love. And then some figures who only show up in our class through Botticelli. The one reaching into her blouse or her dress right around her midsection and pulling out flowers to toss out is known as Flora. And Flora is a personification of fertility. Next to her is Chlora and Zephyr. Zephyr is a wind that blows in the springtime, and Chlora is kind of the budding stages of sexual maturity or fertility. She's actually blossoming flowers out of her mouth that come over here. So everything that you see in here, including the abundance of flowers down below and the fruit in the trees, these are all symbols of fertility. And what we believe this work was a marriage picture. A picture that was commissioned from Sandro Botticelli to reference the idea of beauty, meaning something that is understood as partaking of God's essence, filled with symbols of, frankly, fertility, given to a young couple. This painting would have been given to a young couple who had just married, and sometimes the couple's not so young, but the woman's always young. The man might be much older, in order to ensure that they have a very productive marriage and produce lots of beautiful, meaning godly children. Put up here close on her. Again, Botticelli doesn't really use a canon of proportions, and frankly, canons of proportions aren't really used to represent female forms very often. He makes up his own form of beauty, and you can see in his work over and over again, he will represent the same face. That face was his favorite model's face. There was a woman in Florence at this time whose name was Simonetta Vespucci, not related, I think, to the Vespucci family, Amerigo Vespucci's family, who gave the Americas their name. He was an explorer. But she was the most beautiful woman in Florence, and it seems pretty clear that Botticelli was enamored with her, and he uses her beautiful face to represent beauty in his works, and he'll use her face over and over again. You can see this too. In almost every representation of beautiful women, you'll see a swelling of the abdomen. That was seen as sexy in its time, and it was also an indication of fertility. See Zephyr, right? All in blue, meant to represent the winds blowing in Flora, who is basically blowing in Chlora, like chlorophyll, you can think of it that way, blossoming into Flora here, the epitome of fertility, who's covered with flowers, right? And she's pulling flowers out of her dress here. Three graces, again, beautiful female forms. Their faces are all that same face. and all of this meant to be a symbol of fertility. Perhaps Botticelli's most iconic work of art. This is a work known as The Birth of Venus. Now, once again, for Renaissance times, the birth of Venus gets cleaned up quite a bit. In the Greek story, the Greeks, they're pretty literal with their mythology. In the story of Venus's birth, she is actually birthed by being created out of the severed genitals of Uranus that are spread. Uranus is an earlier Titan or giant, one of the earlier, they exist before the Olympian gods, who was killed by the Olympian gods, and his severed genitals are thrown into the sea. You think of the sea as kind of the primordial stew from which we all come. Oh, that was a bad turn of phrase there. Sorry about that. No pun intended. Severed genitals thrown into the sea. We derive from the sea, and you can see how the fertility aspect is used to explain her birth. For instance, if you wanted to represent a goddess associated with wisdom, such as Athena, her story of origin is that she springs fully formed out of the head of Zeus without sex involved at all, thus emphasizing her rationality. In Renaissance times, however, she begins to be represented floating to shore on a scallop shell. And the scallop shell, like all shellfish, is kind of symbolic of aphrodisiacs or sexuality, but it's quite cleaned up. And frankly, you'll see these types of shells used on baptismal fonts to represent the idea of purity. And this is Botticelli's way of saying this isn't about sex, this is about the perfect, beautiful female form. And thus what you're seeing is almost a manifestation of the divine. Venuses are done in multiple different types, and just before I go into this, over here is her attendant, the symbol again of fertility, that's Flora, and over here once again you see Zephyr and Chloris coming into the scene, symbols of fertility again. Form of Venus, who's of Venus, comes from old Greek sculptures. This is the Aphrodite of Cnidus on the left-hand side, one of the first, and it's actually a Roman copy of a Greek original, one of the first of the freestanding Greek nudes. And she's coming out of her bath, and she's what's known as a Venus Pudica form. A Venus Pudica means a modest Venus. And I always thought this was a little bit funny because she's supposed to be kind of shy or covering herself up, but they always do a really piss poor job of covering themselves up. They don't quite cover the areas that are supposed to be off limits. And we see that as well over here with Botticelli's Venus. She's trying to cover up her breasts, but doing a really poor job. And don't feel like a pervert if your eye just keeps following that line of the hand and pointing towards her breast and you keep looking there. It's done on purpose. Anytime you use the hand to cover something, our eyes are going to follow that line of the hand. Same thing with her hair down here. Hair is a symbol of sexuality, as I said. Obviously, the goddess of love is going to be full of sexual potential, but notice how it's bound up. Some of it's kind of frang free, but it's bound up to say this is sexual kind of desire in potential rather than going crazy. If you ever see a woman in Western art who's got hair kind of flying all over the place, she is a femme fatale. She's something to be worried about because she's going to try to seduce you into doing something bad. And Venus is just filled with sexuality, but it's kind of bound up, controlled in a way. The other, though, so Venus Pudica, there are two other forms of Venus, and these two forms of Venus are known as the Venus Celestis, the celestial Venus, who is always represented without her clothes on. The celestial Venus is a personification of beauty with a capital B and is not meant to be sensual at all. You're not supposed to look at her and say, damn, she's really hot. You're supposed to look at her and hear angels sing or something. It's all about perfect beauty and godly beauty and so forth. It's like nudity in the Garden of Eden before sexuality is introduced. And the other form of Venus is what is known as the Venus Vulgaris, which we don't see here. The Venus Vulgaris is earthly beauty, which is sensual beauty. It's meant to be moderately erotic in its form. Her form is always the Venus Celestis. right? Let's get up here a little bit closer on her. There's that perfect, beautiful face, very symmetrical, based upon the modest semen out of Vespucci. You see the emphasis on line. He's not trying to make hair look like it really looks. He's emphasizing these beautiful, beautiful kind of S-curving lines all the way through, rather than how hair looks. And that emphasis on line is also in the contour lines of the body. Look at how strongly he emphasizes these contour lines. It's not the way a body really looks photographically, or how the breast is a perfect circle. This is the body submitted to ideals. Disegno, or line, because it appeals to the mind, and of course proportionality, because that's God's perfection in the world. Just brief, I wanted to show you that, a lot of these things have moral messages to them. A lot of the Italian city-states were constantly battling with one another, and this is Botticelli's famous Greek myth of the triumph of Venus over Mars, or Venus and Mars. Venus is married to the god of the forge, Vulcan, or as he's known in Greek times, Hephaestus, but she's constantly stepping out on him. And one of her main paramours is the god of war, Ares or Mars, who she's constantly conquering through seducing him. So the metaphor here is kind of the triumph of love, and love can not just mean sexual love, it can mean love of one's neighbor, love of humanity, over warring, and that's always seen to be more morally just. So in this case, what you're looking at is the Venus figure who has seduced the god Mars, their lovemaking has been so strong or powerful that he is, I always laugh at this, it's totally typical male, right? He's totally zonked out. He can't even wake up, even though the satyrs over here, half men, half goat, are like blowing conch shells in his ears. He's not going to wake up, right? The triumph of love over war there. I should also say that satyrs and any kind of Greek animal that is half man, half beast, like a satyr who is half man, half goat, or a centaur who's half man, half horse, are symbolic of the animal passions of humankind, like they're half human, but they're ruled by their animal natures as well. And so you see that. I think I just find it funny, right? Look at the surveying look of Venus, just looking at him like, oh man, they're so easy. At the end of his career, Botticelli gets very religious, and I'm not going to talk about this work a great deal. You can read about it more in your textbook. He begins to question whether he should have been doing all of these Greek myths and so forth, since they are from pagan society. Many artists do this at the end of their lives, especially if they're Christian, because they start worrying, what is God going to say when I get up to the pearly gates? He is also deeply influenced, though, by a very passionate priest who was giving sermons on the streets of Florence. This priest's name is Girolamo Savonarola. Girolamo Savonarola, if you've ever seen a period movie about Florence at this time, you will have seen this guy. He's kind of crazy, fire and brand, brimstone spouting, everyone's going to hell kind of thing. Preaching on the streets of Florence in the 1490s in particular. And he starts before this, but he really gets rolling in the 1490s. And he gains a huge following of people because the year 1500 is looming, and those millennial years are scary to people, especially Christians at this time, because they think maybe this is the time when the book of Revelation stories will come true, and we'll have the apocalypse and the judgment of all souls and so forth. So, fire-breathing priests tend to get pretty popular at these times. The other thing, though, that Girolamo Savonarola is preaching against are the Medici family themselves and what he calls the cult of paganism, including these kind of mythological scenes. So this weighs heavily on Botticelli, and he turns at the end of his career back towards very, very standard religious scenes, such as this one that's known as the mystical nativity. In the mystical nativity, you see, again, he's hedging his bets right and left. It's a manger / grotto cave again. We've got all this standard symbols, including the ass and the ox. And here is Joseph and Mary. He doesn't know whether to believe. Remember, we saw in Hugo van der Gogh's work, Jesus on the ground at his birth, kind of, illuminated. That came from the mystical vision of Saint Bridget. He doesn't know whether to believe that or not. It's very popular. So he puts Christ down there, but then he hedges his bets and puts him on a white cloth and kind of props him up because he thinks maybe, what if Saint Bridget got it wrong? And then finally, he puts up above all of these angels and down below, angels literally wrestling with classical philosophers. Remember, classical philosophy is what allowed him to create the works that he was creating based upon these Neoplatonic principles. And so it's like he's wrestling with, is it religion? Is it classical philosophy? Can they ever kind of come together? And in case, we didn't know which side he really emphasizes here, on all the banners of these figures, you can barely see them. And down below, it's actually written out. It says, "Glory be to God in the highest." So, the classical philosophers lose out here. So let's end this lecture with just a couple of brief examples of Pietro Perugino's work, and to get us to start thinking more about how the formal elements of painting work and how they partake of this aesthetic philosophy. This is a work by Pietro Perugino, who's most well known as being the teacher of Raphael Sanzio, who we'll see next lecture. It's a work that's called The Delivery of the Keys to St. Peter. And it's a very popular subject for Catholics in particular, because in this story, and it's part of the Bible, Jesus tells Peter, "Upon this rock, build my church." And he gives them, again, this is metaphorically, the keys to heaven. What is meant by this is, on the one hand, Peter is understood to be the first bishop of Rome, and the bishop of Rome is the Pope. And so what we get from the story is that, why do the popes have the power that they have? Well, because Jesus gave it to them directly and said, "Build my church here." Right? And as Protestantism starts to rise in the 1500s, this will be a way that the Catholics say, "What are you guys doing over there with your own religion? Jesus gave us the rights to be in charge of this religion." So it shows you those rights. The other thing, though, is it establishes the Christian church as the pathway to God through the church, through the Pope, who is the top of the Catholic Church. That's the only way that you gain entrance into heaven. Now, very quickly, remember what we said about classical stylistics. They're all about, and high Renaissance period stylistics, they're all about creating the ideal. And you had a list there, so let's go through it. This is a pretty good example of this. In the foreground, and notice how space has been organized. We've got a foreground, then nothing. And then middle ground with these figures and buildings, then nothing, and then a deep background. That's that division of space. In this picture in the foreground, we have figures that are all the same size. They all partake of a perfect canon of proportions, right? That's one ideal. Number two, we've got a focal point. Look at how Jesus has his own space, and he's right in the center of the picture. We look at him first. He's most important. He looks down at Peter. We go down the line of the keys towards Peter. He's secondary importance. And then you can probably see it. The artist has used linear one-point perspective again. Look at the lines of the piazza, all receding back to a central vanishing point here in the middle of the doorway that frame these figures and move us back to the church and say, from this action, the church was established. Therefore, the church is our pathway to heaven. Right? Other stylistics we pointed out, right? Ideals, unity. Everything in this picture is supposed to be here in order to further the message. Everything's connected to another thing. And this one's not perfect, but he's trying to do that. Symmetry. If you split it right down the middle, you have equal weight on both parts. A building here, flanked by a building here. These are both Roman arches, by the way. So you have pretty much perfect symmetry here as well. Colors. There's no intense, vibrant colors. They're all next to each other or toned down colors on the color wheel so as to create harmonies. And now let's practice our formal analysis. This is Pietro Perugino's work called The Crucifixion with Saints. And this is an altarpiece. This is what it looks like as the total altarpiece, but we're just going to look at the central here. Here on the right is the central crucifixion scene, and I've juxtaposed it against this crucifixion scene over here by another artist of almost exactly the same time period, but who was not influenced by classical works of art. He was an Italian by the name of Carlo Crivelli, but he worked out of Tuscany. He wasn't learned in Neoplatonism, and he's not adopting any of those classical styles. But otherwise, these are two paintings that have almost identical subject matter. We've got a crucifixion scene, right? We've got the Virgin Mary and John the Evangelist in both scenes. We've got a water scene in the background. There's a harbor back here, and we've got a little bit of a cityscape back here too. But they feel quite a bit different. And the question is, why? Well, here's one of them. For the classical artist Perugino over here, Christ being crucified doesn't look like such a bad thing, does it? I mean, there's no pain in that body. It's an idealized, perfect body made out of perfect proportions. There's very little indication even of blood, no indication of any kind of pain that this body went through. But it goes even further than that, doesn't it? The landscape sets the tone. This looks like a happy landscape full of beautiful analogous colors, all of which are very natural, and you can almost hear birds chirping back there. It also goes to the figures that are beside him. We look at Christ first. He's the focal point, right? He takes up all the space in the sky. His head tips down. We look at the Virgin Mary here. What's her response to the death of her child? Well, it's a very rational response, not something filled with a lot of human emotion, right? This is her kid. This is the Messiah dying, and she's just like, oh well. And John the Evangelist, too, on the other side, oh, well, sorry. No high emotions here because, of course, they believe in depicting the most perfect, glorified representation of Christ rather than something that is, historically accurate. They want something to be rational and to appeal to the mind rather than the emotions because they see that as something ideal. Notice how you move around this picture. She looks down, you look down here, and there's a little kind of stick holding up the cross, and then this other stick points us up at John, and he points us over here. There is a compositional element that makes this very stable, right? A vertical and a horizontal, but you also see the implied lines of this triangle here from Christ's head to the other two heads that add stability to the work and thus de-emphasize emotionality as well. Now, if you look over at Crivelli's work, there are a whole host of differences. Number one, think of that body. That body does not look like an ideal. It looks like something that's been hanging on that cross for a while. There's a lot more indication of pain on the face and pain on the faces of the Virgin Mary and John the Evangelist. This is going to add emotion to the work of art. Going further than that, though, all of these little jagged lines of the rib cage, on the one hand, we might associate them with an emaciated figure, a figure that hasn't eaten in a while, but short little jagged choppy lines also agitate us, and we've got a lot of them here. Down in the foreground where we're supposed to be standing, all these short, choppy, jagged, diagonal lines of the rocks agitate us. All the lines of the sweeping drapery of John the Evangelist agitate us. That's going to play up the emotional qualities of this. Over here on, Pietro Perugino's work, we know what those colors are. They're all roughly analogous. Over here, it's hard to even give a name to the colors. And if you can't give a name, your mind's constantly kind of working at it. And this also agitates us or increases the energy of the work. In Pietro Perugino's, you have a foreground, then a space, and a middle ground, and then a deep background. Over here, look at how a space is so compressed, collapsed. You can't quite tell how far away that's supposed to be from something else. This is actually a pathway behind him going back to a tomb, but you can barely tell that, and that agitates us as well. The final thing that I want to emphasize is that over here, Christ composition, while we still have a triangle, Christ is way down here right next to the earthly figures. Up here, he's high above them. And that's important. If this one emphasizes the human pain of Christ, at least relative to the Perugino work, putting Christ in the composition down among the humans makes sense. If over here you want to emphasize the idea that Christ is ideal and perfect and partakes of God, put him up higher, up against the sky, right? Make him even more important, higher, that is, than the Virgin Mary and John the Evangelist. And by extension, think of where we exist, way down here below these characters as well, so as to cement this kind of hierarchy, right? Actually, a couple more things. We play up the idea of the skull here that emphasizes the death of Christ and where this took place. Right over here, no skull, but just pretty flowers. He will be reborn in heaven. Well, that's the lecture for this week. It's a fairly long one, but it gives us the main ideas of the Renaissance proper in Italy, and we will pick these up next week with a lecture on the three major players in what's known as the High Renaissance, artists who came of age at the end of the 1400s but continued to produce in the beginning of the 1500s. And those three main guns are, of course, Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael Sanzio, and Michelangelo Buonarroti. See you next week.